Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Riccardo Pedrazzoli, and I'm a visiting professor of Faculty of Architecture of Ferrara, Italy. I have to thank the Transurba organization, and in particular my good friend Nariman Mansouri, who organized the whole mission of us, and of course our good and beloved Indian host. I don't make the whole list because we are already a lot in late, but okay. Let's start. When I've received a list of questions that were intended to be the guidelines of our activities, I mean the workshop, the discussion, I get very interested in the first one. There was a pretty long list, also very deepening and technical, but I found very fascinating this first one. Do you read? Maybe we can turn off this one. No, the question, I can read it directly from the screen, is to what extent can the traditional living cultures of Europe be transformed to satisfy contemporary needs? I think that the fact that cultures of living coming from the past can be projected into our times, our era, and influence and improve our way to live, our urban context, our everyday life is not just a fascinating perspective, is a tremendous necessity, is a hope that we don't have to lose. Nowadays we are assisting to a transformation, a continual transformation of our human environment, which is getting day by day colder, less communicative, less made for interaction. We have, of course, to look at the past as an example of ourselves, our same mankind, in a time in which, okay, with many other problems of economical and social kind, anyway had better way, we say, to leave their community. So I would start with an Italian project. This housing complex you see from this picture from above is a pretty famous task that has been realized in Rome in the years between 1950 and 1954 in the popular quarter of Tiburtino. The housing complex that also has the same name of the quarter is popularly called the Tiburtino Quarter. Has been probably the most famous and meaningful output of the short season of Italian neo-realism. The neo-realism has been a mainstream involving also literature and especially cinema. The cinema, I mean, in the cinema probably it earned the better results, that rose short after the end of World War II as a reaction to the horrors of Bellic events. The philosophy was that after a long time in which Italians had been victim of impositions of different kinds, 20 years of fascist regime, a modernization sometimes unexpected and sometimes unwanted, but especially a war seen by the side of the losers, let's don't forget it. After this long time of imposition, it was necessary for art to get back speaking the language of common people. Interpreting their needs, their fears, their ambition, the small ambition of, poor people getting out of a war, you know. So that's why in all the disciplines, and in this case in architecture, the logic was to renounce to all the intellectual experimentations, to try to speak more simple language. That's why this complex has been conceived as, sorry, I'm getting some difficulty with the PowerPoint, has been conceived as a sort of rural village. You have to imagine that Rome was also at the time a 1.5 million inhabitant city, and this housing complex has been conceived instead as a peasant village in a way, with an irregular street plan, with irregular, informal streets, no straight lines, a lot of differences in the relationship between the vacuum and the and the houses. And the architecture was also very informal, containing many features of the popular architecture, kind of the internal patios, gardens, kitchen garden also, because it was supposed to interpret also a rural identity of the Roman hinterland. And last but not least, also the formal aspect of this building was very easy readable, easy understandable. There were many typologies, tower houses, row houses, and so on, with dozens of different apartments, different configurations, almost never a straight corner. It was a simulation of the spontaneous development of a urban context. Nowadays, we can say that that experiment that remained isolated, at least at this level of, of extreme compromise. But the experiment hasn't been a complete defeat, hasn't been a complete unsuccess. It remained somehow inside the imagination of Rome. Also nowadays it has been painted with these very flashing colors that wasn't foreseen in the original project. And I mean, it's of course picturesque, but it's evidently artificial. It's evidently something that has been planned for simulating spontaneity. And more than this, all around, as I told, it has been built in the 1950s. All around it has been eaten and surpassed by an expanding city that was earning population and was completely changing during the industrial and economical boom of Italy in the 60s, expanding with many other popular quarters, accepting to live in front of infrastructures and evolution of its economy and its social configurations. What can we say? That it's probably not wrong, but too ambitious to think that recreating in fake way the traditional architecture of the past, we can regenerate, make born-again traditional cultures of living. We have to accept that the world continually changes, especially in this year in which the changing due to technology and evolution are not a linear way, but an exponential way. No, pagina nera. We have to accept that our culture of living is evolving. We have to interpret it. There was theory expressed by very, very smart philosophist and semiotic professor whose name is Edoardo Lombardi Vallauri, who said, well, our good friend know him, that once was talking about the fact that in the whole history of mankind there are witnesses of old people telling about the health. Oh, the today young has no values. The today young has no culture. Today young has no respect or things like that. It's not just our grandfather that are saying this of us. Also, their grandfather was saying the same of them. Problem is, no, it's true. I mean, the fact is that if I have a classical culture, I've studied ancient Greek, ancient Latin, and so on. If my music was classical music, maybe some jazz, and I see my son or maybe my nephew, and they are listening to modern music and maybe communicating with the SMSs and things, I say, okay, that's the ignorance of the new generations. That's not true. Okay, I search for the Greek in my son. I look for the presence of the ancient Greek or ancient Latin. I don't find it, and I say my son is an ignorant. It's not that. He's just communicating in a different way. He is accessing to the huge global network of the internet. He has a different lever for gathering information and transmit information. That's more or less for the cultures of living. We have to accept that the world is evolving, and What instead is the menace is that we are losing the capacity of, I mean, the cleverness in communicating, in sharing, in living together our everyday life. So, getting a little faster because otherwise my presentation won't never least 30 minutes. This is, we make a jump back of 20 years. This is a very famous project by Le Corbusier. It's the project he made for the Algerian capital Algiers in in the beginning of the 30s. This is a worldwide famous project because that was the visionary period of Le Corbusier, and these images in every history of architecture book. The project is very famous, especially for its macrostructural size. Le Corbusier was foreseen to make a huge dike building running on parallel to the coast, many stories high, with not million, but thousands and thousands of people living inside. And there was a motorway on the rooftop. It was an integration between the infrastructure and the architecture, I mean the territory scale architecture. But there was something much more interesting in this project than this feature. We don't have to forget that that was Le Corbusier that a few years before have proposed to raise down half of Paris for build up huge skyscrapers and substituting the whole historical fabric of the city. Also, if it was in its megalomaniac years, in this project, I mean the Planobus for Algiers, Le Corbusier expressed a very, very interesting concept that many years after has been rediscovered. The huge dike building, which was a violent architectural gesture, was intended to be just a structure. I mean, it was kind of a shelf with many cells inside that the users were free to set as according to their needs. We can see inside these, I mean, between the stories, these duplex houses, 2 stories houses, and each one is different from the others. There are some of them which are made in modern style, but someone else, there's one with Arabic arts, you know, arcades. It's in Moresque style. The idea was that the architect was just projecting the superior order, let's say, leaving to the user the freedom to adapt his own living environment according to its needs, to its preferences, also to its aesthetical taste. That's something, I say, that has been recalled many years after by the Dutch structuralists, which were a group part of the great movement that started in the 50s to criticize the acts of modern movement, their too straight-edge philosophy, trying to rehumanize the modern architecture. That's where my lecture takes the name. This is a sketch by Aldo van Eyck, a Dutch architect, which, with a very simple complex, applies this structural ideology also to the connection, the link between the urban scale and the house scale. It says that a tree in the end is just the reproduction in big scale of a leaf, and the leaf is the reproduction in smaller scale of a tree, you know, kind of fractal logic. And at the same time, every house should be considered as a small city. Every city should be considered as a very big house. The fact probably is that our cities nowadays, I'm talking about the European example, are no longer and not at all looking like houses. There are no rooms, there are no way to give a personal touch to the environment, to the spaces, no way. It's just kind of an electronic chip with monofunctional pieces connected by infrastructures. It's cold and it doesn't leave any space to the personal expression. One of the inspiring concepts instead of structuralism has been this strange and enlightening painting by the painter Constant Neuhaus. This looked like an abstract painting. Instead, is a concept plane of his utopic project New Babylon that has been thought in the 70s after a visit to a nomad camp in Piedmont in northern Italy. The Constant Neuhaus went to small city in northern Italy and noticed that the gypsies were no longer allowed to live inside the municipality territory because they were used to camp in the market square, leaving a lot of garbage and everything when they left. So the major decided with a small local law to not permit them to stay in the municipal territory. So a painter, a friend of Constant, Pinot Galizio, had a piece of land and he let them use it. And Constant Neuhaus and his friend went there to observe these gypsies, to study how they can arrive in 2 days, create a city from the beginning, just posing their roulotte in different ways and obtaining squares in a way, roads, small squares, and recreating a geography of the sentimental or just friendship relations between the parts of the community, and then just leave and reconstruct the city, maybe in a slightly different way somewhere else. So Constant then elaborated this concept and proposed this also very utopic project for a city that was expanding through covered spaces that then can be completely adapted by the inhabitants according to their personal taste. Those were, of course, utopic projects, but now I will show you some practical examples that are, of course, not physical realization of these visions that I've shown you, but can be in a way inspiring for understanding which would be a great potential that we are very rarely using nowadays. This is an housing complex. No, it's not correct to call it an housing complex. It's an expansion zone of the city of Amsterdam that has been built up in formerly commercial pier in the port, in the seaport of Amsterdam. I think there's been a competition, and the winning group was the landscape and urban planning group West Acht, which proposed a very interesting interpretation of the volume that was necessary to build up. They proposed to put on these 2 piers a few big buildings with very dense activities inside or very low-cost social housing, and to manage all the rest in a way traditional, in a way very innovative way. So creating some lanes, parallel lanes, and dividing them in thin lots, as more or less as the historical Amsterdam was made. All these small lots were supposed to host one single family house, and the funny fact is that each lot has been given to a different architect, so that in the end the result was the same urban typology has been reinterpreted by many different modern architecture that all of them gave their own personal interpretation. I mean, there was a master plan setting the structure, setting the main rule, which was, of course, started for about traffic, passage, public and semi-public, pedestrian roads, connection to the city. So there was a mind above that thought the functionality and the efficiency of the whole complex. Then the pieces, the tiles of the mosaic has been left to the imagination of single architects. Of course, this one is not a cheap project, and it's a kind of architectural review in 3 dimensions. When you start visiting it, you never stop. The effect is the multicolored impact that we can find in a historical city. you know. Probably what really disgusts us in modern housing complexes is that everything is equal, everything is always the same, especially for large-scale buildings. The same hand projected all the buildings, and probably there is the same formal features, there are the same colors, there are the same proportions. Instead, here, instead in the historical CD, we got a layering of different periods, of different interpretation, many buildings, even just the same typology, but made by different people. And in the end, we have this idea of, the variety, the multiplicity. That has been smart and, not wrong way to obtain the same effect without calling back traditional architectures. These are objectively modern houses, no doubt on it, but getting there's something of the old Amsterdam getting back. It's more or less what probably Le Corbusier thought to do on the Plan Obus. I thought that project wasn't that cheap. This is the cheap version probably of that project. It's been planned by Elemental, the group of the Chilean architect Aravena. It's a small, in the end, housing complex for not so wealthy people. And it's been published in many reviews, so the architects among us probably have seen it thousands of times, but it's part of my discussion. The idea was very, very simple. There were these row houses made by 3 vertical blocks, duplex houses that one can reach climbing up the external staircase, and for each 3 tower houses on the top there were 2 flat apartments on the ground floor. So here you can see 5 apartments, 3 above and 2 below. They were made with very cheap but safe materials, with plumbing and everything, which in the slums of Chile city are of course, as in all the slums of all over the world, are often not present. But the innovative thing was that the eventual integration and expansion of these houses was left to the initiative of the user. You bought a house or you rented the house, then you were free to modify it inside the vacuum volume that was left specifically for that purpose. That was the complex some months ago, maybe a couple of years after the completion. And you can see that many people decided to expand their own houses. I don't want to lose too much time, but there are also many pictures of the internal spaces that in the basic version were very, very cheap, with no paintings, not at all, and then the users decided to modify and to interpret as they wished. When we talk about the initiative of personalization, we think about common people, let's say, and it's hard to imagine a normal inhabitant of a European city to start personalizing and setting his own house, as we've seen that the Chilean made in their slums in the project by Aravena. Actually, all the apartments, most of the apartments of ancient Europe are equal. The only thing that makes difference between standard flat in Northern Europe and Southern Europe is the presence of the bidet in the bathroom, but all the rest is equal. The same IKEA furniture, the same basic settings of high-tech objects, kind of LCD screen, DSL connection, console with video games for the sons, the babysitter of the year 2000. And but we have to imagine that this gypsy spirit of taking possess of a place and modify it for our use is something that is inside mankind, is inside human beings. This is the city of Copenhagen in Denmark, where in the beginning of the 70s there has been a very particular event. A group of hippie, I know that I'm the right place for talking about those stuffs because you also know what's an invasion of hippie, but in this case, a group of hippie, a community, a small community, decided to occupy a quarter of old military housing that has been dismissed, abandoned after the moving of the military base outside the city. Now I have to show where the place was. More or less here, and taking also a big part of the channel riverside. They entered inside. It was a demolition built inside. That part of the city was supposed to be demolished for building new houses, and they occupied it, and it happened 40 years ago, more or less. The place became autonomous community that the municipality also recognized. I mean, they gave it kind of semi-official, loyal acceptance, and what happened? That the community increased in number, but not becoming overpopulated, and settled down a few common rules for living inside, which were part for avoiding the access of crime and bad stuffs, in part also for encouraging the cooperation between the inhabitants, and it is actually, let's say, virtually self-sufficient. It has its own garbage system with recycle boxes and things. There are small factories. Oh, it's
just 5 minutes. Do we have half an hour? We just have 5 minutes more. So
it's 25 right now.
We need to have discussion also.
Okay, but I can also close it right now. No. Yes, okay, let's finish with these examples. The inhabitants of the community built up their own houses. Of course, there were no rules and no restrictions, and they built up with wood and other materials houses, as you see. Very strange. One can imagine that this kind of initiative can be something that is just when one is forced by the necessities, and instead, as you see also in the civil Northern Europe, people, if is allowed to, can give its imagination a free output. Yeah, that's very interesting. Floating houses with the floating dog houses also, you know. Okay, I think it's better if I stop it here. That's the matter. I mean, I think we all have this spirit inside us. We can all.
The slides. You just see the slides.
Hmm?
You just go through the slides fast.
Okay. Okay, this was a project in France in which the architect used, terraces for giving to the inhabitants the possibility to have something its own to take care of. The garden even can be an expression of the individuality. This is another project in France made by a group of architects that used all the very bad concrete buildings, expanded, just using the same structure, but given a completely different sense. Just even opening a window in a larger size can be a way to completely change the sense of an architecture. Okay, I think there's nothing more interesting to show. That's more or less. But I'm not. Thank you.